This evening, we're reading the first 9 verses of Leviticus chapter 1, which is found on page 102 of the Church Bible, and we'll also go on to read a few verses from Hebrews 9 afterwards. Starting at Leviticus 1, verse 1. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. He said, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when anyone among you brings an offering to the Lord, bring as your offering an animal from either the herd or the flock. If the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, you are to offer a male without defect. You must present it at the entrance to the tent of meeting so that it will be acceptable to the Lord. You are to lay your hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on your behalf to make atonement for you. You are to slaughter the young bull before the Lord, and then Aaron's sons, the priests, shall bring the blood and splash it against the sides of the altar at the entrance to the tent of meeting. You are to skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. The sons of Aaron the priest are to put fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. Then Aaron's sons, the priests, shall arrange the pieces, including the head and the fat, on the wood that is burning on the altar. You are to wash the internal organs and the legs with water, and the priest is to burn all of it on the altar. It is a burnt offering, a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Lord." And then we move on to Hebrews 9, verse 11, which is page 1207 in the Church Bible. "But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands. That is to say, it is not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them, so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God." This is the word of the Lord.
Nice to see you. If you're joining with us this evening as a visitor, you join us at week 2 of a 6-part series we're doing in the Old Testament book of Leviticus, which admittedly for most people it's quite ancient, it's quite strange, it's quite difficult to understand. And so we're just taking these 6 weeks to say, let's do the sort of 30,000-foot overview of the book to try and understand what are the big themes and ideas, what's the big message of the book. And I'd encourage you each week to bring a Bible with you, because each week, we'll just have a little poke in a couple of places, sort of slightly beyond just what we've had read. So that might be helpful. And in light of that, if you don't have a Bible and you'd like one, we've bought a load to give away. So just on the back table where you came in, they look a bit like this. Because we want you to have one. If you like one, you just haven't got a Bible, don't own one. We bought these specifically with the intent to say, please have one. Please take one. Don't feel at all embarrassed. Take one, take it away. Read it, bring it back with you. Hopefully it will be a great help to you as we dig into this together. Now, if you've got your Bibles and you've got them open at Leviticus chapter 1, that is where we're going to start. And I want to start with a quote by a preacher, pastor, theologian, a man called Tony Campolo, who once wrote or said these words. He said, "Rituals keep us from forgetting what must not be forgotten." Okay, rituals keep us from forgetting those things that must not be forgotten. And we have rituals in our lives, don't we? So nations have rituals. Something like Remembrance Day is that annual thing that we all do so that we do not forget that which must not be forgotten. Individuals have rituals too, don't they? Maybe you or your family, perhaps you have significant dates in the life of your family, and you do something to mark them because you say that this is so important. We do not want to forget these things that we think ought not be forgotten. Some rituals aren't really rituals at all, they're superstitions. So when football players, insist on putting their right sock on before their left sock, or hopping 3 times before they get on the pitch, that's not a ritual, that's just a slightly weird superstition. We're thinking about rituals. And in the Old Testament, what we're looking at here, the book of Leviticus, God's people are given these rituals, these things which they do both individually, but as a nation too, as we're going to see. They're given them as sort of teaching aids, because God is saying, look, here are some things which I do not want you to forget. These are things which must not be forgotten. And that's why these rituals are put in place for you. And so last week, if you were here, we started with a big picture overview. We talked a little bit about this picture, didn't we? We said the book is shaped a bit like, there's a technical name for it, if you remember. It's called a chiasm. And that's where kind of the outer edges match, and then the next bit is in match, and the next bit, and then the center of the book is kind of the heart of the message. So this week we're looking at the bottom layer, rituals, which you find in Leviticus 1 to 7. That's the individual or the family rituals. And also in Leviticus 23, 25, that's the kind of the national rituals, the thing that the nation does, their festivals. And we're going to have a little look and think about both those things and what they're there to teach us. And then each week we'll do a different thing. So next week's a baptism service, but the one after that, we'll look at the priests. The week after that, the purity. And then Alan will finish as we think about atonement at the very heart of the book. So we're going to do this in 2 parts. We're going to look first at the individual offerings, which you find in Leviticus chapters 1 through 7. And then we'll jump ahead to, for the second part, to Leviticus chapters 23. We're actually only going to look really at 23 this evening to think about the national festivals. And I should say as well, for some of you, what I'm doing will feel deeply unsatisfying because there's so much more that could be said. Okay, and if that's you, come and find me afterwards. I can point you in the direction of a ton more resources if you want to go down kind of the rabbit hole, as it were. But I want to try and do something that helps all of us get something of a handle on what this book is about. So as we look at the opening to Leviticus, the opening chapters, the opening 5 chapters, you've got 5 offerings, and these are they. And then in chapters 6 and 7, there's a few more instructions for the priests about how they do this. But there's basically 5 main offerings that are given to individuals or to families in Israel to bring. They can bring them at different times. They bring them for different things. The latter 2, the sin offering and the guilt offering, they are to be brought anytime you become aware of a sin you've committed. And that could be, in chapter 5, that's described as, chapter 4 and 5, that's described as, that could be the priest who sinned, or the whole community that sinned, or the leader that sinned, or any member. They become aware of their sin and they bring a sin offering. The guilt offering is, again, that sense of you're aware that you've incurred guilt before God, and there's a sort of offering you bring for that. And the first 3 really belong together, but we'll come back to that. The point of these different offerings is they essentially depict sin in slightly different ways. So, for example, the burnt offering, you bring your offering, you lay it on the altar, and the whole thing is burnt up. None of it is eaten. It is all burnt up, and there's this kind of this sense of my sin is brought and it's transferred to that animal, and it is entirely consumed in the fire of God's purity and holiness. My sin is an offense which needs to be forgiven and consumed and taken away. In the sin offering, the description is much more one of pollution. So in chapter 4, the interest is less in the animal and more in the blood, because the life is in the blood of the animal. And the blood is just getting sprinkled everywhere. You think, what on earth is going on? And because the picture is one more of pollution or defilement. And so the image is my sin pollutes and defiles, makes unclean, and there must be a way to clean or to cleanse me from that. The guilt offering depicts sin as a debt I've incurred which must be paid. So all of these different offerings kind of depict sin in different senses. It is an offense to be forgiven. It's a pollution that needs cleansing. It's a guilt. It's a debt that needs paying. But all of them show you the seriousness of sin. That's the big sense you get of it. Is you go, actually, my sin, the ways in which I've held God out of my life, that's not a minor thing. That's not a small thing. That's a really huge and significant thing. And actually, to deal with that requires nothing less than the life of another, a sacrifice. Because the Bible says, look, the wages of my sin is death. That's actually what it deserves. And so it's only through the death of another that it can even begin to be described as being dealt with in any meaningful sense. It's such a serious thing, and it's such a costly thing to deal with. If we look just very quickly at some of the details in the burnt offering in chapter 1, as we had it read, you'll get a bit of a sense of this. We're told in verse 3, if the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, you are to offer a male without defect. So that's a cost in itself, because they didn't eat a lot of meat in ancient society. It wasn't hugely readily available. Meat was costly. And for you to bring the best, the one without defect, you are offering something that costs you a great deal. Because sin is serious, and it's costly to deal with it. Now, and notice how involved the worshipper is in the burnt offering. Look at verse 4 and on. Notice how many times you see the word you. You, that's the worshipper, or the head of the household. You lay your hand on the head of the offering, and it will be accepted on your behalf to make atonement for you. Verse 5, you slaughter it. Verse 6, you skin it. Verse 9, you are to wash the internal organs and the legs with water. And when you read that description, it kind of makes coming to a normal church service seem fairly boring, doesn't it? It's fairly civilized, really. But this is what they did. This is what they're expected to bring these offerings, and a family would probably do this more than once a year. They'd bring this, and they'd be so involved with this that they'd bring their best, and they'd have to go through the ritual of putting their hands on it and killing it and butchering it and cleaning it. Because it's designed to teach you, look, sin is serious. Nothing less than life itself pays for the seriousness of sin against a perfectly pure and holy God. And this teaches you in the most graphic sort of way. And in the New Testament, you learn the priests would have done this. They were doing this morning and evening. Can you imagine how many families there are in Israel? And at different times, they bring their offerings. Morning and evening, the priest stands and they go through this day after day after day after day. So don't think of priests as these sort of slightly kind of pompous, well-dressed figures who prance around. They're more like butchers who do this dirty, smelly work all the time. Because God needs to tell the people, this says just how serious sin is. And this is what it costs to deal with it. Now, I said to you, it's better to think about the first three belonging together, because sin is serious, the offerings are costly, but there is also something here of an invitation, I think. The first three belong together. Here's why I think they belong together. Because in Leviticus 1, verse 1, we read, the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him. And then that phrase doesn't occur again until chapter 4, verse 1, at the sin offering. The Lord said to Moses. And in between, in chapters 1 to 3, this phrase, this will be a pleasing aroma, occurs 8 times. And it occurs about all of these three together. And then in chapter 3, verse 5, we read, Aaron's sons are to burn the fellowship offering on top of the burnt offering. So you're meant to see these as belonging together if it's not too irreverent. Think about a McDonald's. Like, you can just have the fries, but the meal really needs the burger and the drink. These three things are part of a whole. And there's a sort of journey involved in it. You come and you make your confession, and your sin is transferred, the atonement is made and dealt with. And then you bring your grain offering, which is really a sort of tribute offering or a thank offering or an offering of worship and adoration. It's thanks to God because your sin is dealt with. And then you do the fellowship offering, which is really a meal. And you see this in the instructions to the priests in chapter 7, verse 15. The meat of the fellowship offering must be eaten on the day it's offered. So as you come with these first three, They're of a piece. You come and you make confession and your sin is dealt with. The grain offering thanks God for such kindness and grace. And then you eat in the presence of the Lord with your family. There's this movement and this journey: confession, thanksgiving, and feasting. And in a sense, that's sort of what a worship service does, particularly when we share the supper together. We come and we confess, and we hear that word of gracious pardon, and we praise, and we give our sacrifice of praise and thanks, and then we eat together in the presence of God. Because, and isn't this remarkable, he graciously invites us, in spite of our sin, to eat with him. He's the one who gives the instruction. He's the one who provides all of the instructions to say, look, this is how sin is dealt with, and this is how you come, because I want to be in the center of your lives. I want to be at the heart of your community. I want you to come and have genuine fellowship with me. And so you get to the New Testament application and you start to see just a few interesting things, don't you? So in Ephesians 5, for example, Paul says, look, walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. Jesus is that one who, the pleasing aroma. Jesus is that kind of offering par excellence, that most pleasing and most fragrant of offerings to God. Or in the reading we had from Hebrews, where we read this, didn't we? The blood of bulls and goats, in other words, what's happening in all these 5 offerings, sprinkled about, well, it makes you sort of ceremonially clean, ritually clean, outwardly clean. But Hebrews says, look, the blood of bulls and goats can never really actually take away sin, because an animal can't really pay for a human, but Jesus can. As a man, he can pay for fellow human beings. Because he's divine, his blood is of infinite worth. So how much more, verse 14, the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished, he's the Lamb without blemish, to cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to God, that we may serve the living God. And then this verse in preparation struck me this week in a slightly new way. Romans 12. Now imagine you're reading this for the very first time as a Jewish person who's become a Christian. And Paul says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. So if you're a first century Jewish Christian, all of your sense about sacrifice and offering is you bring animals, you lay them on the altars, they get burned up. And Paul is saying, we don't do that anymore because Jesus fulfilled all that. But now as a response, you lay yourself on the altar. You no longer put an animal there, you put yourself there. And your very life is totally given and consecrated to God. Your whole life is now this sacrifice of praise and gratitude to God for all that he's done for you. Derek Tidball, in his little commentary on Leviticus, he says this one life must be laid on the altar and totally consecrated to God. It's a very striking picture, isn't it, of the response. We don't make our sacrifice to earn anything. Jesus has done all that. But this is, if you like, this is the thank offering or the tribute offering, the worship offering. It says, now I lay my whole self entirely given, entirely consecrated to the one who has already made atonement for me. So that's the offerings. Five main offerings. There are a few others you can find elsewhere in the Old Testament, but these 5 main offerings which show people different facets of sin, the seriousness of sin, but also God's gracious invitation and God's gracious provision to come. So then, if that's what sort of individuals and families do, what does the nation as a whole do? Well, you flip to the other end of the book, and we're just going to look at Leviticus 23 and the 7 appointed national festivals, which you can actually really think of as 3, or at least 7 in 3 parts. So I showed you this picture last week. So the first 3, as you've got them there in Leviticus 23, are the Passover, unleavened bread, and the first fruits. They all happen actually in the same week, in the first month of the Jewish year, which they call Nisan. For us, it's about March and April time. And then in the third month, they celebrate Pentecost. And then you go halfway through the year, and in the seventh month, remember 7 is a significant number because it speaks of creation and that return to rest. The seventh month, again, you get 3 more festivals. The Feast of Trumpets, then the Day of Atonement, which we'll come back to, and then another 7-day festival, the Feast of Tabernacles. So the Feast of Passover is a 7-day festival. The Feast of Tabernacles is a 7-day festival. And perhaps a way of thinking about this, diagram it slightly differently, again, I'll leave this up, might be like this. So you think about the rhythm of their calendar as a nation and the 7 main festivals. The first month, you go 2 loads of 7 through, and then the third load of 7 in the first month is Passover. So Passover, as many of you will know, that's the festival celebrating their liberation from Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt. When the Passover time came, they sacrificed the lambs. They painted the blood on the wooden door frames, and then and they escaped that night. So that's how they start. 14th day in the first month every year, they remember that moment because it must not be forgotten. The next day, they celebrate what we've got here, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because they left Egypt in haste. There was no time for waiting around and letting your bread rise. So they ate unleavened bread, and the unleavened bread reminds them of their leaving in haste. And then they celebrate the first fruits, which is kind of interesting. And most commentators think it's probably on the 16th day of the month, because in chapter 23, verse 15, we read this: from the day after the Sabbath, the day you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, you count off the 7 weeks. So it's probably happening on the 16th of the month. And this is when they bring the very first fruits of the harvest. It's the start of the agricultural year. And they bring it and they wave it before God as a way of thanking God for providing. So within this 7-day festival, the first 3 days, they remember they were slaves. They've been delivered, and they were delivered in haste. But now they recognize, and this would have been happening in the land, that even though they've been delivered, God is providing for them, and God is caring for them. What's interesting about the first fruits, if that's right, that it's happening on the 16th of the month, then Passover happens on Friday. The Feast of Unleavened Bread happens on Saturday. First fruits happens on Sunday. And interestingly, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 20 writes this: Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who've fallen asleep. Which of course would be true, wouldn't it? If Jesus raised on the Sunday after Passover Friday, he's crucified on the Friday, raised on Sunday, he really is the first fruits. He's the fulfillment of all that pointed to. He's the first fruits of a very different sort of harvest. Not a harvest of grain, but a harvest of souls. And then they count off their 7 times 7 days, because it's number 7. And after you've done 7 times 7 days, you get to the 3rd month, and the Feast of Weeks, which by the New Testament is called Pentecost. The First of Weeks is the end of the harvest. So you get the start of the harvest, the end of the harvest. Again, it's another way of thanking God for his provision for them. But interestingly here, by the time you get to the New Testament, they've also started to use Pentecost to celebrate the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, because that happened the 3rd month after they left Egypt. So it's about the same sort of time, about the 50 days since they leave Egypt. So there's this sense of it's a harvest festival, and it's a celebration of the giving of the law. And so you go forward into the New Testament, you get to Acts chapter 2, the first Pentecost after Jesus rises as the first fruits. And there you've got Jesus pouring out his Spirit on all people, and the law now being written on tablets of human hearts. Not on tablets of stone, but now being written on human hearts. And then you get a massive harvest. 3,000 souls in a day, which actually is really just the beginning of all that God is going to do. So you do that, you go halfway through the year, you get to the 7th month, and then you get the last 3. So in verse 23, the first day of the 7th month, You have a Sabbath rest, a sacred assembly commemorated with trumpet blasts. We're not told much more what that's about. The trumpet blast seems to be a way of sort of calling the nation together. In the New Testament, the trumpet blast is a sign of Jesus about to come back. There's an anticipatory sense of waiting for God himself to come. And then they count off 10 days, and then they celebrate the Day of Atonement, which is really at the very heart of all of their offerings and sacrifices and festivals. Atonement's the very heart of it, and we'll think about the Day of Atonement in much more detail in a few weeks' time. And then you get to the 15th month, so you've counted off 2 loads of 7, and then you have another 7-day festival, the Feast of Tabernacles. And this remembers, and again, remember that they'll be in the land at this point celebrating this, in the Promised Land. At this point, they have this 7-day festival where they stay in these sort of pop-up tents, if you like, and they remember that throughout their journeys from Egypt to the Promised Land, they stayed in these temporary booths, these temporary shelters. It reminds them actually, in a sense, God's people are always pilgrim people. Even when they're in the Promised Land, they're always journeying. Again, you start to make some interesting links, don't you? It's fascinating in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where Paul describes his body as a tent. He says, while we are in this tent, we groan and are burdened because we do not wish to be unclothed, but to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling. Maybe it's possible that Paul even has in mind then, he's thinking of the feast of booths, the Tabernacles feast, and thinking, well, in a sense, I'm always in this tent. Until I get to the permanent dwelling, until I get to the permanent promised land, the new creation, I'm always in this place of waiting. So in a sense that the first festivals look back a little more. The second half of the year, the 7th month festivals, they look forwards a little bit more. They celebrate and they anticipate. And they remind the people, don't they, as you go through this cycle, each one reminds you of something different about the gracious character and work of God. The festivals remind the people that the Lord graciously delivers and provides and protects and nourishes and accompanies his people in spite of their sin. In spite of their sin, God is making all this provision for them so that he can journey with them and they with him. All of the offerings and all of the festivals are just as much actually about God's grace as they are our sin. Yes, they tell us about the horror and awfulness of sin and how it's dealt with, but they tell us a lot about the graciousness of God and the lengths to which he will go to be close and to be with his people. And so the rhythms that God gives his people by which they worship him, that they're not given as sort of a purely dutiful religious burden that they have to do. They're given as a gift. They're given as a means of grace by which the people, well, they're kept from forgetting that which must not be forgotten. Now, we don't do all of these things, do we? And the reason we don't do them all is because Christ has fulfilled them. And so now we're given a slightly different rhythm and pattern. Every Lord's Day, which is in a sense a mirror of the Old Testament Sabbath, but it's now become the Lord's Day, the first day of the week, not the 7th, because that first day of the week is Resurrection Day, it's New Creation Day, and so we do new creation sorts of things. We gather and we have God speak to us and we praise him and we eat together. We do all those things, but that's our given rhythm, isn't it? That weekly rhythm, which is given as a means of grace to help us. A means of grace so that we do not forget that which must not be forgotten. And so in a moment, we're going to come to the Lord's table to celebrate the Lord's Supper together. And this one is the one that's perhaps most closely connected by Jesus, isn't it, to his own life and work. Because it was as his disciples gathered in that upper room to celebrate Passover that Jesus says, actually, this bread's broken, and this wine poured out actually represents my body. It represents my blood. Because I am going to be the lamb, the perfect, necessary and appropriate sacrifice to deal with your slavery, not your slavery to Egypt, but actually your slavery to sin. And so he says, whenever you do this now, we're not thinking Old Testament Passover. Whenever we do this now, Paul says we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. And so as we take the supper, we celebrate and we anticipate.